Good evening, everyone. Please direct your attention to the screen.
We'll never own up to our past.
We'll never build sustainable cities.
We'll never set foot on another planet.
We'll never stop the overdose crisis.
We'll never find a cure for Alzheimer's.
We'll never treat each other as equals.
We'll never clean up our oceans.
But together,
we have the potential.
We have the potential to shape a different future.
Different future.
A different future.
Welcome to UBC Connects. For today's event, we'll be using a web-based platform called Slido. It lets you ask questions in real time. It works on any mobile device, so take out yours and follow along. We'll show you how to get started. Although we do want you to use your device, please make sure it's on silent, as we don't want to interrupt the program. Now, once you've confirmed that your device is on silent, pull up your browser and go to slido.com. Now enter the event code UBC Connects. You'll see the hashtag symbol is already populated. All you need to do is enter UBC Connects, all one word. Now you're all set to submit your questions by clicking on the Ask button. Other people can like your question by giving it a thumbs up. When we get to the question and answer part of the program, our moderator will ask the top-rated questions first. You can start submitting questions, but they won't be visible until the moderator appears. At that point, you can start voting. Before you go, we have one more thing to ask. We'd like you to take out that mobile device one last time and go to the polling tab. That's where you'll see a few questions about your event experience. Please do take a moment. Your feedback matters to us. Enjoy the program.
Please welcome to the stage student in Global Resource Systems and UBC MasterCard Foundation Scholar, Njoki Mburu.
Yes! I wish that song was a bit longer. Good evening. My name is Njoki. I am a student in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems in my third year in a very small program known as Global Resource Systems. And I am also a MasterCard Foundation Scholar. I have the privilege and honor to be introducing Professor Santa Ono before he introduces our guest of honor today. We are thrilled that many of you have joined us today in this room as well as online for the event. In a few minutes, Professor Ono will tell you more about the Connect series. First and foremost, I'd like to take some time to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam people. To me, this always reminds me of my responsibility to remain respectful to the cultures and stories and peoples on this space. And I invite you to take a moment to think about what this land acknowledgement means for all of you. Following Ms. Adichie's presentation, Aisha Chaudhry will moderate an in-conversation with Ms. Adichie and then open up for a Q&A with the audience. Professor Chaudhry is the Canada Research Chair in Religion, Law, Social Justice. She is a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellow, where she is leading a feminist Sharia project, and a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. She is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Gender Studies at the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at UBC. She is also an author of Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, and forthcoming book of personal essays titled The Color of God. Tonight's program will be live streamed for those who could not be with us this evening, like my mom. That's all good. The audio podcast, as well as the video, will be posted on the event website at www.ubc.ca/UBC Connects. In the following days, you can share it with your friends and family. As you just saw, the Q&A will be using an online audience engagement platform called Slido to include everyone in the conversation, even those of you at home can participate. As a reminder, you are able to submit the questions now and throughout the presentation that Ms. Adichie will give, but we are holding off on posting the questions that you submit until our moderator takes the stage. At this time, you will begin to be able to vote on the submitted questions. If you'd like to tweet during the program, please use @UBC and hashtag UBCConnects. Okay, let us get started. It is my pleasure to tell you more about Professor Santa Ono before I invite him to the stage to say a few words about our honored guest. Professor Ono earned his BA in Biological Science at the University of Chicago and his PhD in Experimental Medicine at McGill University. His principal research interests focus on the immune system and eye disease. Early in his career, Professor Ono held a variety of teaching, research, and administrative positions at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, School of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, University College London, Emory University, and finally at the University of Cincinnati, where he served as president starting in 2012. In 2015, Higher Education named Professor Ono America's most notable university president. He is now the 15th president and vice chancellor of the University of British Columbia and the host of this new public lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ono to the stage.
Thank you, Njoki, and I'm excited to be here in another sold-out evening at UBC Connects. Thank you so much for joining us here at the University of British Columbia. UBC Connects is a public lecture series that features the world's most esteemed thought leaders and focuses on pressing global issues. And I hope that you've had a chance to join us previously and that you will think about joining us at future lectures. I'd like to first recognize our colleagues at Alumni UBC for their support of the series, and I hope that some of you are alumni of this great institution. Tickets for our next speaker, Dr. Helen Fisher, Senior Research Fellow at the Kinsey Institute and Chief Scientific Advisor for Match.com, will go on sale on August 8th. You can visit ubc.ca/UBC Connects for more information. And I have a feeling that that might sell out in 30 minutes as well. We are delighted to have two incredible speakers as part of UBC Connect's series focusing around International Women's Day, a priority for UBC. Last week, we welcomed Tarana Burke, the founder of the #MeToo movement, in the first UBC Connects lecture in the Okanagan. And our speaker this evening is another powerful voice, one that we are proud to welcome to this institution. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is an award-winning Nigerian author whose work has been translated into over 30 languages. Her very first novel, Purple Hibiscus, in 2003, won the Commonwealth Writers Prize and a Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Her second novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, won the Orange Prize and was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist and a New York Times notable book. Her 2013 novel, Americanah, won the U.S. National Book Critics Circle Award and was named one of the New York Times top 10 best books of that year. Ms. Adichie is also the author of the story collection, The Thing Around Your Neck, and her most recent book, Ijeawele, or A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions, was published in March of 2017. She has been invited to speak, not only here but around the world. Her 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, is now one of the most viewed TED Talks ever. Her 2012 talk, We Should All Be Feminists, has started a worldwide conversation about feminism and was published as a book in 2014. In recognition of all of this, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2015. In 2017, Fortune magazine named her one of the world's 50 greatest leaders. She's a member of both the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, two of the most prestigious honorific societies on this planet. She has received honorary doctorates from Eastern Connecticut State University, the Johns Hopkins University, Haverford College, Williams College, the University of Edinburgh, Duke University, Amherst College, Bowdoin College, and SOAS, the University of London. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Ms. Adichie this evening a huge round of applause and welcome her to UBC.
Hello. It's so nice to be here. This is my second time in Vancouver, and I think I'm going to enjoy this visit more than the last one. The last one was fine. Thank you, Professor Ono. Thank you, Njoki. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. I actually want to hear from you, and so I'm just going to say a few words, and then I want it to be more interactive so we can have a conversation. But I would like to start by, start by telling you that I am a bit jet-lagged because I've been flying around quite a bit. I was in Nigeria, and then I was in London for a day, and then I was in Maryland for a few hours, then I came here to Vancouver. No, then I went to New York, and then I came to Vancouver. And so the reason I say this is, if at some point I start to sound incoherent, I will not be held responsible for that. So in the past few days, I felt a kind of deep-seated mourning because of the Ethiopian Airlines crash that happened just outside Addis Ababa, in which so many people lost their lives, including a Nigerian-Canadian writer, Dr. Pius Adesami. May he rest in peace. May they all rest in peace. I found myself imagining the utter devastation of the loved ones, their sense of numbed shock, the awareness that really this is a beginning of a grief that they will carry for the rest of their lives. And it has made me wonder, as such things invariably make us wonder, what life means. It made me think that we must live with meaning, that we must let the people we love know that we love them, and that we must find joy. America may be the only country in which the pursuit of happiness is an enshrined constitutional right. But it seems to me that this is, in fact, the central point of being alive. We want meaning, we want love, but those ultimately are about joy. We are all in pursuit of joy. So how we go about obtaining joy and what counts as joy will differ, but to be alive, to be human, is perhaps always to be in pursuit of joy. Throughout the course of our lives, many things constitute obstacles and barriers to this pursuit of joy. I started thinking about this because I was trying to come up with my own definition of sexism. And so this is what it is. For women, the fact that they are born women is very often a large obstacle in their human pursuit of joy. there are many other definitions of sexism, but I sometimes think that poetry speaks to something larger and universal and human. And so this is my definition of sexism, at least for today. So I think we should change laws that diminish women, but changing mindsets is even more important. We should enact policies that support women, but changing cultural attitudes is more important. And so for me, the fundamental question is about our culture. Every culture has its automatic assumptions. What are the automatic assumptions that we make about women? How do we see women? I've spoken quite a bit about feminism, and sometimes I'm used to be called a feminist icon. I don't know why people do that. I have, in fact, started thinking about getting a hat that says feminist icon, which I will wear from time to time. I do not have such a hat yet, sadly, but apparently I'm supposed to be a feminist icon. And it's the sort of thing that, you don't quite know what to do with your face when people call you that. Right? So when I'm being introduced somewhere and someone says, the feminist icon, I'm thinking, should I laugh? Should I smile? Should I look sober and somber? I mean, what's the deal, right? But, and also it comes with this sort of, all of these expectations. People expect me to have all the answers about sexism and all the problems in the world that affect women. And really, I think, the role that I see that I occupy is that I was fortunate to be given a platform because of my writing, because of my fiction writing, and that I chose to use that platform to talk about one of the things I care about very deeply, and it's feminism. I was a feminist long before I knew what the word meant. And I didn't become a feminist because I read books. I became a feminist because I watched the world. And as a child, it was very clear to me that the world did not extend to women the same dignities that it extended to men. And there was so much about the things I observed as a child that just didn't make sense to me. I was struck by how a lot of my socialization as a girl was very much tied to men. I was encouraged to do domestic work because this was supposed to be what I would do in my husband's house. I was expected to be ambitious, but not too ambitious, because that would intimidate men and would then get in the way of what seemed to be my life's goal of marriage. I was often encouraged in overt and not so overt ways, not to always say what I thought, because one had to protect the fragile egos of men. And my dressing, the things I chose to wear or not wear, when they were talked about, it was also always about men. So don't wear a miniskirt because you might be raped, or wear something because then you might attract somebody who will, again, grant you that great gift of marriage. I love that laughter. I don't know where it's coming from, but I sort of feel like it's also laughter that is that recognizes what I'm saying. I think many women, and of course, and again, I think that the examples might differ, but I do think that cutting across cultures all over the world are just certain basic things about the ways that girls and women are socialized, that so much of one's socialization as a girl is tied up into the expectations of living in a world that is not just male-dominated, but also male-appeasing. And as a child, I just found this genuinely strange. And particularly because I was struck by how the socialization of boys didn't much consider girls. My brothers were expected to be strong, to be wealthy. And they were praised when they cleaned their rooms, and when they did domestic work, this was seen as remarkable. And also I was struck by how, I don't remember anybody ever telling my brothers, do so and so because that's what your wife will expect from you. And as a child who didn't think that marriage was something to aspire to, I felt out of place. And at the time, I didn't have the language to articulate what I felt. Of course, what I felt was that I was a feminist. What I felt at the time was that women and men were equal, boys and girls were equal. What I felt at the time was that gender should not limit what I was supposed to do, should not define what I was expected to do. But I didn't have the language to articulate it until many, many years later. But when I was a teenager, when I was about, I guess maybe 14, I was having an argument with a friend. And this friend, a boy, who both of us thought we were very clever. And so we, in the manner of teenagers who think they know much more than they actually know. And so we would have these arguments about, I don't know what. But I remember that in the middle of one of the arguments, he said to me, "You're a feminist." And just even the expression on his face was terrifying. It was clearly not a good thing to be a feminist. And I, not being quite sure what feminist meant, and not wanting to lose the argument, I sort of mumbled and then moved on. And at the back of my mind, I was thinking I'm going to go home and look it up. And so I went home and I looked up the word feminist, and I thought, yes, that's what I am. And I also remember thinking, why did he have that look on his face? Right? Like, feminist sounds like the most perfect thing to be. And since then, I have owned that word. But of course, I went on to learn, to read, and to understand its history, and also to acknowledge that it's a word that is weighted with many, many negative stereotypes, and that it's also a word that has a particular Western understanding. And for a person like me who grew up in Nigeria, for whom the expressions first wave, second wave, third wave don't really have a personal connection, it can sometimes be close to irritating when feminism is talked about as though it is only about that particular strand. There's a line I love that says that there are many paths out of antiquity that do not end with the Renaissance. And in some ways, feminism, I think, is similar. I think my great-grandmother was feminist. She is known in my ancestral hometown as a troublemaker, which is a compliment in my book. And of course, she's not part of the documented history of Western feminism, but it doesn't make her any less of a feminist. And I think that in different parts of the world, there have been women who have had the courage to stand up and resist the ways in which the culture oppressed them, held them back, and they were feminists. And so I think of myself as part of a tradition that, while very much aligned with Western feminism, isn't of Western feminism. So International Women's Day was a few days ago. I was in Lagos, and I chose to spend it with the Roman Catholic community at the University of Lagos because I increasingly want to talk about religion on the continent of Africa, because I think it's impossible to engage with gender without engaging with religion in Africa. So I had a wonderful, really interesting time talking to students there, one of whom asked me the question, but how can you say men and women are equal when God made men first and made women to be their helpers? And so while I imagine myself a person used to difficult questions, I wasn't quite sure what to do with that question. I mean, on the one hand, I wanted to burst out laughing. But I didn't, because I realized that the student was articulating something that many people think, which is that religion is justification for women's oppression. And that question made me really think, Right? I don't remember what I said, actually, at the moment, but I went home and I thought about it. But on International Women's Day, I just had mixed feelings. On the one hand, and it's kind of similar to how I feel about what in the US is called Black History Month, it's kind of that thing where you see why it's needed, but you wish it wasn't needed. And so International Women's Day, I suppose it's fine. But I think what I want is a world in which we don't need International Women's Day. But I think also the fact that we have that says something about all the work that is yet to be done. But I was struck by all of these, all of the interesting, mostly generic messages that were sent out by, the Pope, God bless him, I love him, but presidents of countries and all of that. And many of the messages, I was struck by how many of them seem to align with this idea of women as somehow superior beings, women as somehow virtuous. Virtue is a word that I found quite common in many of these messages. I think actually the Nigerian president, I think his message had something to do with women are virtuous and we shall, something like that. And also often about women as peacemakers, right? Women as, in general, women as better humans. I found this very troubling. In general, I find the idea that women are somehow morally better deeply troubling. It's troubling to me because women are not special. And because if the case for women is based on the idea of their being special, then it seems to me a disservice to women, because what we're doing is we're not allowing them their full humanity. The case for women should simply be that women are human, that women are as human as men, that women are as capable of goodness and evil as men are. There are people who claim that if women rule the world, we would have no wars. I'm not convinced. Sorry. Because having observed many all-girls schools, but really, I do think that the danger of this kind of thinking, of women as better, women as beings that we should revere and all of that it's not healthy for women, because the standards for women then become unfair and higher. In fact, they already are. And so we know this from the way that women who are seeking power politically are treated, the way that we expect women in positions of power, women in public office to somehow be morally better. But why? When we talk about sexism, sexism often is something that men do to women. And it seems to me that the conversation needs to be a bit more complicated than that, because it's not the full story. I think of the world as one that is tainted by misogyny. And because we all live in this world that is tainted by misogyny, all of us are tainted by misogyny, including women. And so I would like the conversation about sexism to be complicated a bit more and to include the ways in which women participate in the culture of oppressing women. And to talk about how misogyny can come coated in the language of praise, coated in the language of protectiveness, and quoted also in the language that says that women are somehow morally better. And this inherently virtuous view of women has also complicated the Me Too movement. I feel generally hopeful, optimistic about the Me Too movement, although I also have reservations about it, particularly about the way that it's been covered in the media, about the way that the Me Too story has been told. And it's mostly because often when the story is told, when the stories of women who've been assaulted, who've been harassed, who have gone through the most horrendous experiences, when those stories are told, they're told in ways that still fit a little too neatly with the idea of how women are supposed to be. And so in many of those stories, if not all of them, women are constantly cast as good. So it's, it's as though we cannot have women be complicated, complex, difficult, and still be worthy of sympathy and justice. It's almost as though we need women to be helpless, crying, lacking agency before we can have sympathy for them. And I remember a story about a woman who had gone to a hotel room and she'd been sexually assaulted. And when the story was being told, there was a line about how she went there innocently. And I remember just finding this just deeply troubling. And I remember thinking, well, what if she had gone there thinking, maybe I'll hook up with him, maybe not. And she gets up there and decides, oh, I changed my mind. She would still be deserving of sympathy. But it seems to me that in some way, we haven't quite come to a place where we can talk about women and talk about women's sexuality without somehow having shame be attached to it. And one of the things that the Me Too movement, I think, has made very clear is that we need to start to talk about women's sexuality, and we need to start to allow women to be sexual beings, because unless we take away shame from women's sexuality, then we can't really talk honestly about women's harassment and sexual assault. So this is a culture that tells women to be sexy, but not sexual. And this is a culture that has such things as slut shaming. I find that particularly interesting because what's the male equivalent of slut? What? Bro? Is there? Dog? Nope, there isn't one. There isn't one. So if there isn't a male equivalent of slut, then really it means that when we talk about slut shaming, we're not really criticizing the idea of being promiscuous. We're really criticizing the idea of female sexuality. Because if we collectively agree that we, as a culture, think that to be promiscuous is a bad thing deserving of censure, then surely it wouldn't be limited only to women. But I think it's even more important because women, because of this, I think there's so many instances in which women silence themselves and in which other people silence women because of the stigma of shame attached to female sexuality. And it's interesting that in the West, people will talk about, oh, look how terrible it is in the Middle East, or look how terrible it is where women are not allowed to have control over their bodies. And of course, it's terrible in those parts of the world, but really, it's the same impulse. It's the same impulse that leads to slut shaming. And I think that while we look across the pond to criticize, it's also really helpful to look in our backyards. I would also like to talk about how the rights that we think women have are really a lot more complicated in practice. And so just to say one last thing about women and sexuality. In general, this is in the West, in North America, in Western Europe, women can have sex with whoever they want to. But because there is because shame is part of it, because there is the stigma of shame, and because it has consequences, then maybe we should really ask the question, do women really have that right? And of course, when we talk about women and their bodies in this part of the world, it's often in terms of reproduction, reproductive rights in particular, which is important, of course, very much so. But we should also talk about women's sexuality, because that's equally important. And when we talk about women having the right to walk, we should also talk about how it's really women who often have to think about making that choice between domestic work and work outside the home. And that question, can a woman have it all? Which seems to still be a thing, because, and it's a conversation that I find quite annoying. But no. And the reason I do is that I think it's not a conversation really about women having it all. It's a conversation about domestic work. But I think it's framed in the way of, can a woman have it all? We don't ask whether a man can have it all, because the assumption is that domestic work is the sole preserve of the woman. And so that question, can a woman have it all, is really about, she gets to do the domestic work. Now, can she also be superwoman and walk outside the home? And it's such a complicated thing, because people have panels about it, people have conversations about it, and it seems to me nobody's talking about the fact that it's really that women have to do the laundry, they have to do the emotional work at home, they have to do the scheduling for the kids, they know where the socks are, they decide what goes in what drawer. That's really what it's about. And maybe instead of framing the conversation around, can a woman have it all, maybe we should actually start asking the question, do the men know where the kids' socks are? And so I'm going to say two last things, and then so I want to talk about anger. I want to talk about anger because every time I talk about feminism, somebody pops up to tell me, you're so angry. And to which I say, yes, so should you. But really, I think anger is, of course, a valid human emotion. But it's always interested me what that link between women and anger, the connection between women and anger, and how women are judged very harshly for showing anger. I think in the US, it's terrible for a white woman to show anger because there are consequences, but it's catastrophic for a black woman to show anger. Because the stereotype of the angry black woman is almost impossible to shrug off once it's attached to you, and it ends up affecting everything, opportunities, possible jobs, everything. And I know many, many accomplished women who hold back in so many ways because they do not want to be considered angry or difficult. They don't want to be called a bitch, even if what they're doing is simply asking for their due. Maybe they're asking for a raise, or they're asking to be heard. And for me, there's a sadness there. I think about how much talent we've lost out on, how much potential progress and innovation and all of those things that we collectively as a society have missed out on because a woman held back. Because a woman held back because she didn't want to face the consequences of showing anger or rage. But then when it's men showing anger, we kind of have respect for male anger. And so I'm always kind of amused, not in a good way, but amused, when there's a lot of media space that's been given to what is called incels. And I'm not quite sure why, but there's this idea that there's an anger that comes from an entitlement to women's bodies, and we as a society are supposed to engage with this in a way that is ostensibly constructive. But when women show anger for things that really matter, they are bitches. I've been following quite closely the story of the woman in the US who's running for president, who is said to have been very terrible to the people who work for her. And do you know about the story? I was hoping you wouldn't. I was hoping Canadians don't care about American news. Be nice if somebody didn't care about American news. But also, I wanted to ask, how does it feel, Canadians, to suddenly have Americans looking at you with great, great envy? So I have so many friends who are looking to move to your country. But don't let them, don't let them. So But the last thing I want to say is really that when I talk about anger, it's a larger point about double standards, right? And this is also something that as a child, observing the world was very apparent to me. And in thinking about this now, I remember when Hillary Clinton was, after she was deprived of being president, and she sort of went into, I think, a period of mourning and then re-emerged on the public stage. And I remember reading bits in the news where people said to her, oh, you know, shut up and stop comparing and stop talking about how the media treated you differently. And I remember thinking, but this is actually how one diagnoses sexism. One must make comparisons. We cannot diagnose that something is sexist unless we have something to compare it with. And as a child, observing the world, I noticed these just little things, ways in which a woman would do something, a man would do the same thing, and it would be judged really differently. The way that a man would show a behavior that would be considered confident and praised, and a woman would show the same behavior, but it wouldn't be considered confident, it would be considered arrogant, and it was something for which she deserved some form of censure. And I remember, even as a child, thinking the behavior is the same, what's different is the body showing the behavior. And I then very quickly started to think, maybe the criticism is really not about the behavior. Maybe it's about the body exhibiting the behavior. And so even now, as an adult navigating the world, I'm constantly looking inward, questioning myself about how I react to people, particularly to women. And so in some ways, I think it's also about searching myself for misogyny, because I've grown up in a world that is misogynistic, and because being aware of this doesn't necessarily mean that I am free of misogyny. And so there are times when I find myself reacting to something a woman has done, and I then stop and I look inward and I ask myself, is it really about the behavior that's been exhibited, or is it about the body that's exhibiting the behavior? I think I'll end there and then we can have a conversation. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this beautiful and thoughtful comments that you made today. I'm thrilled to be here to speak to you, to have a conversation with you. I'm excited because I get to sit in your light for a little while. And I'm also really happy to be sharing the stage with a fellow Radcliffe Fellow. So that's really wonderful as well. Yeah. So to get us into the conversation, I'd like to speak to you about some larger themes of your work, and then we can open it up to the audience. Speaking of which, I have to remind the audience that the questions that you've submitted on Slido are now being approved, and you should be starting to see all of the options appearing on your devices. So please continue to input your questions and like other people's questions if you do like them. And then we'll answer them together, and we'll learn about them in the program later. Okay, so to start with, I wanted to start with talking about authenticity. In the past, you've shared that claims of authenticity have been made upon you. For example, you talk about the white professor who said that your stories were not authentically African enough. And I feel that most writers of color, and of course there's different kinds of color, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, especially women of color, confront these claims about authenticity that can be truly confounding when you're actually confronted with that claim. So I've been told, for example, when I write that my experiences are not authentically Muslim enough, or they're not authentically Muslim, they're not authentically Canadian, they're not authentically South Asian. So I wonder if we can talk about that, and if you think it's a helpful way to think about our own work, which is not a thought that I ever had until somebody told me that I was not authentic.
Yeah.
But, and also is it a useful category to judge other people's work?
No. No. Because really, that whole idea is, my experience was a white American professor who read my novel and said to me it wasn't authentically African. And I was confused because having grown up on the continent of Africa and having written a book about the place where I grew up, and then I was being told it wasn't authentically African. And then he explained what he meant. He said to me, oh, your characters are too much like me. They drive cars. And so I realized that really what it was is, I've always found it really interesting, that idea that just the immense hubris that that results in a person coming from a place of intense ignorance, but just having the greatest kind of confidence about that ignorance. So clearly, this is a man who knew very little about Africa. And so in his mind, Africa meant, people had to be starving and dying and whatnot. And so somebody had come from Africa and written a story, and he gets to decide that it's not authentically African. And while this was, on the one hand, funny, but also I thought it was dangerous, because I thought that people like him have a certain kind of power. People like him are gatekeepers. People like him might work in publishing houses, might be the people who might be editors, might get to decide what stories are told. And if they have that kind of thinking, then it's really dangerous, because it means that they deprive the world of real stories, because their ignorance is blinding them. And I don't think, I should say, though, that there is such a thing as authenticity. There are some stories I read about Africa, all of them written by non-Africans, I must say, that I don't find authentic, but they're not based on sort of general stereotypes. They're really just, you kind of read a story that you can tell was written long before the person stepped on African soil, because it's kind of a mix of the books that they read when they were 12 about Africa, and then they wrote. So you can sort of tell. But in general, especially with literature, I just don't believe that one should judge storytelling based on such a thing as authenticity. I think there's such a thing as emotional truth, and it's the kind of thing that I'm not sure I can define, but I can tell when I see it. But I don't also think of my work in that way. Because what's interesting about, I think, being a fiction writer is that often it's the things that are unusual that one finds interesting, rather than the things that are ordinary, if that makes sense. I have the story about when I went to my ancestral hometown years ago, and so I like to romanticize my culture sometimes. So I love the idea of going to my ancestral hometown, because I think my great-grandmother walked on this road, and go to the stream, and I'd be like, my great-great-grandmother fetched water here, and then I'd get really emotional. And so because of this, there's a sense in which, for my own very selfish, romanticized desire, I want my ancestral hometown to remain as it is, right? I want it to be this wonderful little enclave in which people fetch water from the stream. Right? Ridiculous as that sounds, right? Obviously, because people want easier lives and they want. But anyway, so I'm in my hometown. I'm taking a walk with my cousin, and there's a young woman who I had seen earlier. She sold, I don't know, bread or something. And she was taking a walk as well, and it was Harmattan. The road was cracked and bumpy, and she slips and she falls down. And the words that came out of her mouth were, fuck. And I was shocked, right? Because I'm like, we're in my ancestral hometown. It's a tiny village. It's a tiny village in southeastern Nigeria. I thought she would say something in very deep, some sort of proverb in Igbo, or something. But she's like, fuck. And I, of course, immediately whip out my notebook and I write it down. Because I thought, this is remarkable, right? This pretty much this village girl. And anyway, and I remember thinking later about it and thinking, if I wrote about this, the esteemed gatekeepers of African authenticity would question it. They'd be like, oh no, she would never say fuck. But she did, right?
Thank you for sharing that. That is beautiful. And I think that probably a lot of women of color in this audience have had an experience of that. You know, I remember it reminds me of an essay that I wrote that ended with this sentence that says, "This is what a Canadian looks like, MF." So you can understand what that means. And I know that in the motherfucker, and in the peer review process. And in the peer review process, like a white gentleman, a scholar, academic said, I just don't imagine a Muslim woman in a hijab ever saying that. I feel like, you know, the story was about me wearing hijab in Canada. And he said, I feel like that's something, and then he just said the stereotype of who he imagined would say that. And so then wanted me to take that out of my essay. I didn't. But it was that kind of a story. With this, what your comments, I'm going to go off script a little bit because it reminds me a little bit about some of what you were dealing with in Americanah also is, you know, sometimes we want to see something in other people or in ourselves, and we're so committed to that idea of other people or ourselves that we are willing to discount what is in front of us. And I think that you deal with this in Americanah when you talk about the experience of immigrants. When you're away from the homeland for a long time, you suddenly begin to have ideas about the homeland as you remember it from when you left it 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So much that it becomes fossilized in your memory. And then, you know, immigrants have the experience of going back home and just being outraged by everything that they see because everything has changed and it didn't stop growing and moving and changing and evolving while they were gone. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as somebody who was writing when you were away from home and then you're back home. If you could talk a little bit about that process.
So I think now that when I first came to the US, I didn't go home for 4 years because I couldn't afford to. And I was deeply homesick. And my first novel, I think, came from homesickness. It came from this kind of, again, romanticizing home. And suddenly I was just desperate for the smell of the frangipani trees in our front yard. And when I was at home, the frangipani trees were just the frangipani trees. You know, they were just sort of incidental. But suddenly they meant everything. And I think there's a sense in which that kind of homesickness is very much infused in the telling of Purple Hibiscus. And then when I finally did go back to Nigeria, I remember just thinking, it's not fragrant. and there's a kind of, and maybe home means then accepting that this is yours, even though it's not fragrant. Or maybe just knowing that it doesn't have to be fragrant. But there's a sense in which the imagination, the turning of home into fragrance is a coping mechanism. I needed to do that to survive the winters in Connecticut. But then I went back home, and now there's a kind of, but I think that as a storyteller, as an artist, it's always been important to me to be clear-eyed. I love sentiment, I detest sentimentality. And so, it's always, even in the romanticizing of home in Purple Hibiscus, I think there's also a kind of a determination to tell the truth about home. Going back to Nigeria, and now I live in both places, so now it's really different because I kind of feel that I know both places equally. I no longer feel that Nigeria left me, because when I went back after 4 years, I thought, my God, right? You didn't wait for me. Things had moved on. I didn't know the slangs, right? My friends would laugh at me because I was just completely just off. And also I had adopted a number of Americanisms, because that's also an interesting thing. You find that you've changed, right? You go home and you find home has changed, but you've changed. And I had become a person who wanted steamed vegetables. Right? And my friends had no time for this nonsense. And they were like, we do not do steamed vegetables in Lagos. Like, you can have soup with vegetables and oil. But it's a very strange thing, because then as a storyteller, you're grappling with the ways in which you've changed, the ways in which your country has changed, the ways in which your seeing has changed, right? The act of seeing itself becomes even more complicated because of that change. The person that I was before I left home obviously saw Nigeria in a different way. And now, as a person who had lived 4 years in the US, who had I was seeing my home from the outside, and it was very, it was different, interesting, different. It's changed now for me because I have two homes, and neither is exotic. And there's something about that that's calming and freeing. And I think also something about that in some ways I trust my storytelling of both places more now. I do, yes.
Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Because in many ways I see writing as a way of seeing, and you're talking about the ways that you're seeing and the ways that they're evolving and changing. So can you say a little bit more about how, it sounds like in some ways there's a connection between the fact that you can see more or see differently that's affecting your ability to trust yourself in your writing?
Maybe it's more that I no longer worry that I carry a certain, not so much a desire to exorcise, but that not having, I think it's that loss of fragrance, right? It's that when I write about either Nigeria or the US now that for the past 8 years I've lived in both countries, I love both places. I also dislike both places. I like that I can leave both places. I think the reason I like Nigeria is that I can leave Nigeria. And the reason I like the US is that I can leave the US. And I'm deeply grateful to have that privilege, because I know that's what it is. But I think what it's done to my storytelling is that it's taken away from it a certain, it's blessed it with ordinariness.
That ties into your theme about how women should allowed to be real people, which means ordinary.
Yes.
Do you feel like also it gives you a sense of ownership in a way? Like, you have a sense of ownership that you feel like you can tell these stories because you're actually telling your own stories?
Yes. I absolutely feel that I own both places. I'm like, they're mine. And because I feel that they're mine, I feel like I can do whatever the hell I want with them. Right? I can do whatever the hell I want. They're mine. Yeah.
Because I think often women or people of color are made to feel like some stories are ours and some stories are not.
Yeah. Oh, they're mine. America is mine. Nigeria is mine. Yep. Both mine.
That's awesome. Thank you. So thinking about, I want to talk a little bit about, since we're turning back to the question of feminism, there's this book out recently, I don't know if you've heard of it in Canada, it's made a bit of a splash, it's called The Equity Myth. Mm-hmm. And it is a study of Canadian universities. Melinda Smith and her colleagues have written this book, and they looked to see at the diversity and equity offices across universities since the 1980s to see what's going on in universities since universities have made an agenda item to increase diversity and equity in those institutionally. And what they found is that gender equity, it's obviously not equal still, and we have a long way to go. But although we've done better on gender equity in universities, universities have not diversified racially. And in fact, often, gender diversity has been sort of used to not diversify racially. And so it's sort of like they're kind of institutionally get pitted against each other. And so I wonder, and you've written about how you often feel lonelier in your anger about sexism than you do about racism. And I wondered what your thoughts were about, women of color in Euro-American context, where there's often a pressure on us to support feminism without recognizing the various layers of injustices that we encounter, and anti-Blackness versus, and even the racist injustices are not equal, or we're not created equal. So I wonder if you can speak about your personal experience with this, and how do you think we can better reconcile these challenges for a more equitable world?
Okay, so I think I want to clarify that bit about my being angrier about sexism. It's that I'm lonelier in my anger about sexism. So it's not a question of thinking that somehow sexism is worse than racism, which is even just a ridiculous idea, comparing things. And being a Black woman, it's even more interesting because I can't choose to be a woman on some days and Black on other days, right? So, and whenever people, so it's also interesting to me when there's conversation about gender versus race, because I'm thinking, wait, hold on. I'm both, so where do I fit, where? So when it's said that there's been gender diversity at the expense of racial diversity, what that's saying to me really is that it's white women who've been hired, right? Because otherwise it would not hold true that, okay. So,
that's the argument, yeah.
Because, even in the conversations we have about, I sometimes, even the language we use, I find very interesting often, because sometimes I think language clouds the reality of the things that we're talking about. So so I talk about feeling lonelier in my rage about sexism, just because in my own circle, my friends understand racism. And I should say, I mean anti-Black racism. And I mean friends of all colors and races. I never feel the need to explain something racist to my friends and to the people I love. But I am constantly expected to justify and explain sexism. I'm constantly in a place where, and it's a lonely place to be, right? That the people you love and the people who love you, you can sometimes sense that they are thinking, it's really not that serious. And it's emotionally exhausting. So that's kind of why I wrote about so it's not a question of thinking that one is more important than the other, right? I think that the conversation about feminism in this part of the world I remember being struck in the US that the political discourse in America, and they would talk about women are voting for so-and-so, and Black people are voting for so-and-so. And I'd be like, hold on. And so I quickly realized that really, when they say women, they mean white women. I think there's often too much of a default, too much of an assumption that that idea of women really means white women. And I think there's now a bit of an awareness of it, at least in feminist circles, but there's still a lot to be done, I think. And a lot of it really also has to do with listening. And I don't think we know each other's stories well enough. And I do have to say that sometimes the tone of discourse, in general, makes it difficult to hear one another. I think that we are so... and when I say we, I mean sort of educated, well-meaning, wonderful, good people can sometimes be so wrapped up in our own self-righteousness that, and I think a lot of the discourse around oppression and inclusion is really often about calling out. And I think, which is also kind of why I'm not very interested in many of the debates that happen, because I just don't think that people hear one another. And sometimes I should say also that, so there's a thing that white feminism, it's a thing, right? Part of my problem with that is that I don't know. It worries me when white women are asked about feminism and they say, oh, women of color have it worse. Because, well, here's the thing. Because I think there's something about it that just doesn't feel emotionally true to me. And I think it's part of a response. And I'm not quite sure. On the one hand, feminism in in North America has a terribly racist history. It does, right? And we should call it what it is. So, some people will say things like, it didn't always include. No, it was racist. Right? But it was. And, and now we're at a stage where there are more conversations coming out about that racism, of feminism, of Western feminism. I do worry, though, that there are many white women who now feel that the response is to say, I can't even talk about my own oppression because look what happens to Black and Latino women. And I think that shouldn't be the answer. I mean, for me, I remember reading a piece in a women's magazine where a white actress or somebody who was famous was asked about, what is it like for you being a woman? And she's like, oh, no, it's not about me, it's about the women of color. And I remember feeling intense irritation because I thought feminism cannot be, it's now become about a practice of your own goodness. I wanted to hear, here's how fucked up it is for me to be a woman in the world, but here's how it's even more fucked up for a woman who's not white. That would have been perfect for me. And I think that has to be kind of the, right? Because, but I sometimes find, and there are times when, sometimes I sort of read, some sort of feminist talk, and a white woman says something, and a valid criticism is, everything you said is about being a white woman. And I'm thinking, yeah, but that's what she is, right? I mean, there's also that expectation. I don't really want white women to speak for women of color, right? So when a white woman talks about it, I read a book review, the white woman writing about her experiences, and this reviewer was just really caustic. And she was like, it's all about being a white woman. Yeah. But then I thought that if she wrote about being a woman of color, that too would be a problem. So I just feel that we're not having, I don't know. And so it kind of makes me uncomfortable because I don't think that's a good thing for anybody, right? And so it also means that we're not even hearing what's important, which is the experiences of women of color. Because we're caught up in practicing this thing that just feels to me to be a shallow performance. I think we need to hear more, listen more. I also think, though, that sort of mainstream feminist organizations are still too white. And in Western Europe, this is the thing. I went to speak in Amsterdam, and I was hosted by sort of this really wonderful feminist organization. And then I just suddenly thought, wait, then there's nobody Black or Asian or anything. Where are they? It's Amsterdam. And then suddenly this whole story comes out, and then the women of color came and met me, and they said they don't let us do, that, we're not included. And I was just like, Jesus Christ. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. But I just think that the tone of the debate in some ways affects what gets debated. There's also something in sort of liberal speak that's tone policing, don't tone police. I'm sorry, but tone matters, right? There's some conversations that one cannot have because of the tone that's been established. And I'm just really not interested in a feminism that's about performing a kind of goodness. I don't know. I'm a storyteller, and I couldn't write that character and believe that character. Yeah,
It sounds like, connecting it to some of the things that you said in your talk, that you're thinking about, like, the performance of virtue is boring and not useful, but in fact, it's like the introspective kind of allyship, if it's going to be an allyship that's more meaningful and interesting and worth engaging.
And yes. And also, because sometimes, and again, reading that piece where the woman said, oh, it's not about me, it's about women of color. My sense was she doesn't actually know what it's like for women of color.
Yeah. One of the catchphrases that I have, that I say with my students when we're talking about in class about gender and race privilege, often my students, sometimes this happens every time this conversation comes up. Somebody will say, well, what am I supposed to do about my privilege? I was born with it. Do you want me to be sorry about it? I can't keep apologizing for who I am. And the thing that I've started saying that has been useful for me to think about is, use it to lose it. Use your privilege to lose your privilege. That's sort of a way of thinking about your privilege that's not actually about apologizing for who you are, but you know, really like listening and engaging and learning and then doing better in terms of trying to divest from that privilege. And I think I hear you saying that about men, for example. You know, like in one of your TED Talks, I think you talked about going to a restaurant and having a male with you and having the male only spoken to. And so what if the man said, why aren't you speaking to her? Yeah. The same thing with like any like gender segregated spaces from a Muslim context, when men just like leave their women at the door and go into the men's section, like they're all participating in that, in creating those spaces. That's really interesting. You talk a lot also about, you know, I want to like touch on that very popular TED Talk that you have. I think I saw it on YouTube and it had like, I think at this point has about 17 million views. Just a lot, yeah, so congratulations. And you know, you talk about how a single narrative is always dehumanizing because it basically erases complexity. So there's a lot of power, and it's very important to talk about alternative narratives or have multiple narratives. But when we get to multiple narratives, when people try to tell their own stories in their own words, we have issues, as we've just talked about authenticity. And then there's the gatekeepers, right? What agent is going to take the story? What publisher is going to buy it? What committees will consider it for an award? So I wonder if you could talk, you know, you've navigated this train, so I wonder if you could offer some advice to, you know, young writers of color, people of color, and young writers in general who are writing about their experiences. How have you engaged this? And I want to say, like, I'm building a little bit on the idea of, like, you know, Toni Morrison talking about how decentering the white gaze allows her to tell a story in a particular way that wouldn't be possible if she was centering it. But then what if your story is going to, like, in the publishing world, I think I just read something that said that an overwhelming majority, almost 86% of publishing editors are white. So, I mean, if they're being decentered, they're not going to be interested in the story. So can you talk about that?
Some might be.
Yeah.
There's always, the thing is to hope for the one or two who don't need to be the center of everything. Yeah. Such people do exist. They do. Too few of them in the world, sadly. When I had a very difficult time getting an agent when I was trying to publish my first novel. It was set in Nigeria. It had what agents called an African language, bits of it in the book. And so I got many rejections. And so this is 2003. I think it's a bit different now because one of the agents said to me, I can't sell you because you're not like anybody. And then he also very helpfully said, if you were Indian, I could sell you as the next Arundhati Roy. And then I wanted to be Indian for a while. But I did think about how I could make that happen. But then there was a woman, so I got 25 rejections, and then a woman said to me, an African-American woman, who was not in New York City, she was in Washington, D.C. So in some ways, I think she was an outlier of a certain. So she said to me, I'm willing to take a chance on you. And that's how it happened. And she said, write your top 3 publishers, but I want you to know we're not going to get them. And I said, okay. So I wrote the top 3. She sent the manuscript to them, and all 3 were interested. And that's when I started learning that the gatekeepers are often wrong. But the thing is to get one person who's willing to, you know. And I think that what Purple Hibiscus did is that it suddenly said to American publishers that it's in fact possible to publish a book by somebody writing about a country that they really didn't know anything about. I don't know that it's ever going to be terribly mainstream, right? I mean, what I would say to young writers is, don't apologize, don't whitewash your world. Because if you're whitewashing your world, or if you're trying to do, I have young writers who said to me, oh, we want to be mainstream. But even that we need to unpack, what is mainstream? I think really the only thing that I think one might credibly call mainstream would be when you write about vampires and that sort of thing. But then that's kind of disconnected from any cultural or socio-political reality, so it doesn't really count. But otherwise, you know, the writers, you know, Philip Roth wrote about a particular kind of American world. You know, So my point is that writers, especially writers of color, especially writers who have immigrant backgrounds, we really have to start to realize that our own stories are just as important, just as worthy when we're telling them. And we don't need whitewashing. I think any story that's done well will find a home. I really believe that. Now, will it find Harry Potter kind of home? Probably not. Does it need to? No, right? And so I would say to young writers, don't apologize for your world. I just find, and obviously I say this knowing that it's difficult because you're living in a space that's sort of, you're bombarded with all of these messages about, that what you are or where you come from is somehow less than. And I think that there's that human desire to compensate for, but I would say to young writers, don't. Some of the best fiction I've read, often it's fiction in which you can tell that the writer is simply telling the truth. And as a reader, I think one connects to that. You can tell when somebody has watered down their world. You can tell. And as a reader, I feel no connection to it. So really, and I kept trying, and I remember getting those rejections, and this is before emails, so I would send self-addressed envelopes out with two chapters of my manuscript, and then I would get in the mail the envelope, and I would see my own handwriting, and I'd be like, my God, this is not good news, and I'd open it, and it'd be a form rejection. And actually, one of the rejections was a page of my manuscript, and the guy just scrawled, no, and sent it back to me. And so I am still plotting my revenge. I'm kidding.
Well, let this be the beginning. And as someone who did have, my manuscript was returned to me by an editor who said, we already have a South Asian on our list. So they have different answers. The gatekeepers have different answers for people. But here's a question from the audience.
Well, not this South Asian.
So then we have an audience question that says, I loved your book about raising feminist daughters. How would this advice change for those of us hoping to raise feminist boys?
You know, I've been thinking about this quite a bit. I think, I'm not sure it would be that much different, really. Well, mostly it would be that we need to start very early to give boys the language of emotion. I think that it's such a disservice, what we do to boys, starting really young. And my daughter is 3 now, and whenever we go to the playground, I'm constantly watching, because I think part of being a storyteller is that there's a sense in which one is an anthropologist. You sort of look at the world through you're constantly collecting material. So at playgrounds, I'm watching, what are the parents doing? How are they treating the boy? And I live in a very progressive part of the US, but even in those circles, it's often subtle, but you see that the boys get more room, but somehow less cuddling, and that the girls, when they fall, the parents are much quicker to scoop them up, and the boys are somehow expected to, you big boy. And I find that mothers tell boys, oh, boys don't cry, big boy. And only recently, I heard a woman say to her son at the mall, you have to be nice to girls. And I found that very troubling, because I thought, we need to stop saying that to boys, right? We need to tell them you need to be nice to everyone. Because in that kind of language, I thought, this is the beginning of a kind of entitlement to women. Because you're nice to them. It's that women are singled out as the group that you'll be nice to. It's problematic, right? I think it then becomes really mixed up with the idea of you protect them, but in protecting them, you also have an entitlement to them. And I thought I really tried to sort of mind my business, right? But I really wanted to say to her, no, ma'am, he has to be nice to everyone. Don't start this kind of language, And I think it's also all linked to, she probably would also tell him, boys don't cry. I would say we need to give boys the language of emotion. We need to expect vulnerability from them. And I'm a big believer in shame. We need to shame boys for not showing vulnerability. Because we already shame boys, right? We already shame them for showing vulnerability. I think the reason that boys become men who are scared of a lot of things, right? So, you know that thing about men are scared that women will laugh at them, and women are scared that men will kill them. I remember thinking, why are men so scared that women will laugh at them? You know, if women laugh at you, move on, right? You don't have to kill them. But anyway, but don't kill them, please. But I guess my point is that, yes, I understand that shame is not supposed to be a good thing and we shouldn't, but maybe it can be. So what if we expected little boys to be vulnerable? What if when they weren't, we're like, what if, I mean, my thinking is, what if we switch things around? So I think that in the debate, sort of this whole gender, sex debate, people talk about nature and nurture, and we kind of know that it's a blend of both. But I'm a lot more interested in nurture because I think that's what we have control over, right? And I don't think we've tried enough with nurture. I just don't think we have. There's a wonderful line from a novel by Meg Wolitzer where she writes that a character did not think that boys could be tamed, and so she didn't try. And I think, what if we try? Right? I also think that the standards we have for boys and men is way too low. And there's something about it that's quite sad. And what I would say to women raising boys is never, ever praise him for doing anything domestic in the house, ever. Right? He does not get any praise for making his bed or cleaning his room. No, never. It is such bullshit. Because what it does... No, I think it's really... I mean, and it might seem like a little thing, but it's really not. Because even now, the women in progressive partnerships, marriages, where the men still think that somehow doing domestic work is deserving of praise. It isn't. But it's because their mothers said, well done, when they made their beds when they were 12. So, right? I mean, it... But I think one last thing. I think for raising boys, if we insist on raising girls to think about men and boys, I think we should also raise boys to think about girls and women. So we should, say to them, you need to behave properly, otherwise you'll never find a wife. And we should also tell men what women like. We don't do that enough. We really don't. And I think there are people. I was having a conversation with a friend who said to me, I don't think men know, so why should we tell them? And I think we don't lose anything, right? And I do think that there's a section of the Me Too story that is about men who are incredibly oblivious because they live in a society that allows them to be oblivious. And so we do need to have that kind of education where we say to men and boys, here's what women like, here's what they don't like, so don't do it. I mean, seriously, I mean this in a sort of really practical way. And also, I think we need to talk about pornography. We do. Pornography is there's so many young boys for whom their knowledge of sex and sexuality is all tied up with pornography. And also we need to talk about types of pornography, because it's pornography in which women are so terribly objectified. And then you have young girls who buy into that. And so for them, sexuality and sex becomes a kind of performance that's not about their own desire and their own pleasure. I feel that we need to have many more conversations around that with young people, and it doesn't happen. I find that even progressive parents shy away. Oh my God, pornography is terrible. No, your kids are watching it. We need to talk about it. And actually, maybe we need to invest in making good pornography, right? The kind that, I'm not even joking, the kind that shows women participating, enjoying it, letting the man know what she doesn't like, and making him stop when she doesn't like it, and him stopping.
So I feel like pornography is a great point to end on. I don't actually want to end. We're having such a great conversation, and it's an incredible honor to have you with us in this room at UBC in Vancouver.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and joining us today.
Thank
please join me in thanking this institution.
Thank you.
So thank you to each and every one of you for joining us via like in person and via live stream. Ms. Adichie will be joining us in the lobby for signing books. To help everything run smoothly, we have a few small requests. If you could please have your book open, ready for the page that you would like it signed on, kind of like when you go to your gate to get on a plane with your passport, do that. And she's not going to be taking selfies, but you can take a photo of her while she's signing. And then one last request, please take out your mobile devices and go to the polling function and give feedback to UBC Connect for tonight's event. Thank you very much. Bye.